Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are jumping right into Joshua chapter 18. It's a section of this ancient text that really pulls back the curtain on the practical side of things, settling the land.
It really is. We often focus on the big moments, the battles, crossing the Jordan, but this chapter, it gives us this fascinating look at the logistics, the crucial process of actually fulfilling that inheritance promised to the tribes.
Exactly. So the scene is set at Shiloh. The whole assembly of the Israelites, they're gathered right there, and they've set up the tent of meeting, kind of establishing it as the center. The text says the country was, brought under their control. They'd had successes, but there's a catch, a pretty big problem right at the start of this chapter.
Yeah, it's stated very clearly there were still 7 Israelite tribes who hadn't actually received their inheritance yet, their specific piece of the land.
Right. So the land was basically secured, militarily speaking, but that internal distribution, that was far from complete.
Imagine that. You've won the main campaigns, you technically control the territory.
Yeah.
But more than half your groups don't have a defined place yet. No specific spot to live, to farm, to build their future.
It's a huge loose end. It creates this really pressing challenge, I think. For everyone involved, the question becomes, well, how do you go from just controlling the land to actually settling it in an organized way?
How do you divide it up fairly? A whole country among 7 different distinct groups.
That's the mission, really. The mission we're diving into today, getting it straight from this historical account.
And it's Joshua who steps up.
Yeah.
He's the one to address this unfinished business.
He doesn't exactly beat around the bush either. We read him asking the Israelites this really pointed question. How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?
Oof. Yeah, that question is definitely loaded. It hints that maybe there was some delay, maybe some hesitation, or perhaps just feeling, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task.
Could be.
Securing the land was one thing, right? But dividing it, settling it, that takes detailed work. Commitment. Joshua's clearly pushing them, challenging them, really, to get moving and act on the promise they'd received.
And he immediately follows that challenge with a very concrete plan, super practical. He tells them, appoint 3 men from each tribe.
And that's key. 3 from each of the 7 tribes that still needed their land allocation.
Yeah. And he says, I will send them out.
And their job description? It's remarkably specific. Their task is to make a survey of the land and to write a description of it according to the inheritance of each.
So not just a quick sketch.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This is about creating a detailed written record, something that could actually serve as the basis for dividing the land fairly, trying to account for, the needs and maybe the size of each tribe.
And the instructions are also really clear about the workflow. After they do this big survey and write it all down, the text says, then they will return to me. Back to Joshua. In Shiloh.
So you see this very organized process starting to unfold, don't you? First, identify the problem, the waiting tribes. Then, task specific people. Give them clear instructions. Survey. Describe for inheritance. And tell them where to report back. It's like structured project management within this ancient story.
Okay, so the survey's planned, the men are chosen, they're meant to come back with these detailed descriptions. But before they even get to the division part, the text actually pauses to clarify who is and who isn't part of this particular round of allocation.
That's right. It notes right up front which groups were already sorted out or, had a different kind of status. It tells us Judah is to remain in its territory on the south and the house of Joseph in its territory on the north.
So those 2 big ones, Judah and Joseph, they already had their portions. They were settled.
Correct. And it also points out the others who got their land earlier. And Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan.
Ah, right. The Transjordan tribes.
Exactly. And the text explicitly reminds us this land was given to them by Moses himself, before the main conquest west of the Jordan really kicked off.
So they were already established across the river.
Precisely. And then there's that unique case. The Levites. The text says, the Levites, however, do not get a portion among you because the priestly service of the Lord is their inheritance.
That's such a fundamental difference, isn't it?
It really is. They weren't given a block of territory like the other tribes. Their support came from offerings, and they were given specific cities scattered throughout all the other tribal lands so they could focus on their religious duties.
Okay, so that clarifies things. This whole survey and division process we're talking about in chapter 18, it was specifically laser-focused on those remaining 7 tribes. Not Judah, not Joseph, not the eastern tribes, and not the Levites.
Exactly right. So once those surveyors, those teams of 3 from each of the 7 tribes, came back with their detailed written descriptions, these scrolls outlining the land potentially divided into 7 portions.
They brought them back to Shiloh.
All right, back to Joshua.
And then for the final step, actually allocating these 7 portions, the text describes Joshua's action. He would cast lots for you in the presence of the Lord our God there at Shiloh.
Now this is fascinating. It's this meeting point between, intense human effort, the surveying, the mapping, the writing, and then this reliance on the divine. They did all the hard groundwork. But the final distribution, it wasn't just left to, say, human negotiation or maybe political maneuvering.
Yeah.
Casting lots in that ancient context was a common and accepted way they believed revealed God's will, or at least his approval.
Especially when done in the presence of the Lord, right there at the central sanctuary.
Exactly. It wasn't seen as just random chance. It was a way, in their view, to ensure the fairness and the legitimacy of the whole outcome. It attributed that final decision to divine oversight.
So the plan is locked in, the men are appointed, and the survey mission actually gets underway.
Yep. The account says, as the men started on their way to map out the land, Joshua instructed them. He basically reaffirms the key points,
Reinforces the mission.
Right. Go and make a survey. Write a description. Then return to me, and I will cast lots for you here at Shiloh in the presence of the Lord. The instructions are consistent. Underscores how important this all was.
And the text confirms they did it. So the men left and went through the land.
And look how they documented it. They wrote its description on a scroll, town by town, in 7 parts. That detail on a scroll, town by town, it just emphasizes how thorough and organized they were being.
Yeah, it wasn't a quick look around.
No way. It sounds like a systematic, detailed inventory and description. They created these documents that could then be used for a really precise division.
And, mission accomplished, they returned. And returned to Joshua in the camp at Shiloh.
Exactly. They brought back the raw data, if you will, for that crucial next step. The actual allocation of the inheritance.
Which brings us right back to Shiloh, to that culmination, the casting of the lots. The text says, Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh in the presence of the Lord.
And there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions. This is it, the moment of truth, where those surveyed portions get assigned, by lot, to the waiting tribes. This determined where each one would live, their territory.
And the account immediately zooms in on the very first result, the first detailed outcome from this process. The lot came up for the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan.
So, Benjamin, they're the first tribe whose inheritance gets described in detail in this chapter as a direct result of this lottery system. And the text immediately notes their location relative to their powerful neighbors. Their allotted territory lay between the tribes of Judah and Joseph.
Think about that positioning, nestled right between the 2 biggest, probably most politically important tribal groups.
Exactly. It puts Benjamin in this geographically central, strategically really significant spot.
What's particularly striking to me is just how much detail the source provides for Benjamin's inheritance right after mentioning the lot came up for them. It's not just you get the land between Judah and Joseph. It gives boundaries, lists towns.
It really does. The text shifts from the general process to this very specific example. It's almost like reading the first deed, based on that survey. And it gives this incredibly meticulous description of Benjamin's borders.
Right.
Now, the text lists tons of ancient place names here: springs, valleys, hills, specific towns, even landmarks like stones. It can be a bit much to follow every single name without a map in front of you, but what really stands out is the kind of description it is.
Yeah, it's not just vague lines on a map.
Not at all. The description follows this clear path. It uses geographical features that people would recognize on the ground. Rivers, like the Jordan on the east. Hills, like the northern slope near Jericho, or the south slope of Luz, which is Bethel.
Valleys too, right?
Yes, valleys like Ben Hinnom, the valley of Rephaim. Specific water sources, the spring of Nephtoah and Rogel and Shemesh. It even uses towns, sometimes towns belonging to neighbors like Judah's Kiriath Yearim, to mark border points.
And even landmarks like the Stone of Bohan.
Exactly. So instead of just saying, the north is roughly here, the south is there, they are essentially walking the boundary line in the description, marking it by observable features, things people would know, down to specific springs or notable stones.
That level of detail, naming dozens of points along the border, it really underscores the the legal and practical importance of having clearly defined territory, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't enough to just say somewhere near tribe X.
Yeah.
The boundaries had to be unambiguous to prevent future arguments, future disputes over who owned what inheritance. It really reflects a society that valued precise definition of property rights.
And it's interesting how it explicitly places Benjamin's southern border running right alongside the Jebusite city, that is Jerusalem, puts them in direct contact with what would become, arguably, the most significant city in the whole land.
Oh, definitely. Even though it wasn't fully under Israelite control at this point in the narrative,
Right.
that connection is hugely significant later on. Their southern boundary touches the very city that becomes the capital, sitting right there on the border between Benjamin and Judah.
So we see this meticulous defining of the borders, all four sides. Starting at the Jordan, looping around through hills, valleys, hitting key landmarks, coming back to the Jordan again.
Yes, and the text sums up the boundary part by confirming these were the boundaries that marked out the inheritance of the clans of Benjamin on all sides. It's a complete geographical definition, derived straight from that survey work.
But then the detail goes even further. The text doesn't stop at the borders. It then lists the specific cities and villages within those boundaries that were given to Benjamin.
It does. And again, rather than us trying to read out every single ancient name here and getting lost,
Right.
so let's think about what this list represents. The text groups them. It tells us, for instance, one group had 12 towns and their villages, and another group had 14 towns and their villages.
That's a significant number. 26 listed towns, plus all their associated smaller settlements.
It is. So they didn't just get defined territory. They were assigned established settlements located within that territory. The survey wasn't just mapping empty land. It included these existing towns and villages.
Okay, so the inheritance included both the land itself and the places people were already living.
Precisely. Listing the cities makes the whole allocation really tangible, really complete. It's the culmination of that survey work identifying what was actually in the territory being assigned.
And the text wraps up this whole detailed section on Benjamin's portion by stating simply, this was the inheritance of Benjamin for its clans.
Confirming it. This detailed geography, this list of settlements that constitutes their tribal inheritance as determined by the lot.
Let's just pause for a second and bring this back to you, the listener. When you hear about this whole process, appointing surveyors, mapping the land, describing it town by town on scrolls, then using lots and seeing the result detailed with such, well, painstaking precision, using springs, valleys, individual stones as markers, what does that communicate? It really hits home that this wasn't just some casual land grab.
It really underscores the weight, the significance they attach to this whole act. It wasn't merely, a bureaucratic division of property. It feels much deeper. It was about fulfilling promises made way back, establishing tribal identity, their future, through a defined physical inheritance.
And that combination of methods.
Yeah, the rigorous human effort in the survey and description combined with that reliance on divine oversight through the casting of lots.
Yeah.
It aimed, in their worldview, to ensure both fairness and legitimacy. It really shows that transition, doesn't it? From being maybe nomadic or just a conquering force to becoming a settled society with established legal boundaries, property rights.
So we've traced it from that initial problem back at Shiloh, those 7 tribes wading through Joshua's really structured plan. Survey, map, describe. We understood the special status of tribes like Judah, Joseph, the Eastern tribes, and the Levites. We saw the critical step of allocation by casting lots in the presence of the Lord, which for them signified divine guidance. And then we zoomed in on the kind of detail the source provides. Using Benjamin as the prime example, borders marked by specific geographical features, a full list of towns showing how this distribution actually played out on the ground.
It was definitely more than just acquiring real estate. It was receiving a foundational inheritance, a place that rooted their identity, their history, their future as a distinct part of the larger nation.
So here's a final thought to chew on. Consider the sheer scale of what they were doing settling an entire country. Then contrast that with the incredible, almost microscopic detail the text gives to these specific boundaries, listing every single town and village, like we saw with Benjamin. What does that meticulousness right down to the springs and valleys tell us about how important place, inheritance, and maybe even order itself were in this ancient narrative?
That's a great point. That connection between the big picture, the grand vision, and the tiny details on the ground.
Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.